Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Humanist Canada's webinar series. I'm Anna Popovich, Program Director with Humanist Canada, and I will moderate today. Our topic today is understanding science as a process, why science is not all about results, and we are joined by three guests. Dr. Christopher DiCarlo is a philosopher, educator, and author. He is the principal and founder of Critical Thinking Solutions, as many of you know, and he is also the ethics chair for the Canadian Mental Health Association. Dr. DiCarlo is a lifetime member of Humanist Canada and an expert advisor for the Centre for Inquiry Canada. He currently teaches at Ryerson University and is a past visiting research scholar at Harvard. Dr. DiCarlo has won several awards, including TV Ontario's Big Ideas, Best Lecturer in Ontario Award, and Canada's Humanist of the Year. He has authored several books, the latest of which is entitled So You Think You Can Think, Tools for Having Intelligent Discussions and Getting Along, which was released in June of this year, and he is currently completing his latest book entitled How to Talk to a Conspiracy Theorist, a Field Guide, which will be released in a couple of months. Dr. Guilherme Guzzo is a biologist who holds a master's degree in zoology and a PhD in science education. Guilherme is an assistant professor at the University of Caxias do Sul. Hope I'm not mispronouncing this terribly, in southern Brazil. He is the founder of the local Brazilian science communication project Nas Trilhas da Razão. Guilherme is interested in critical thinking, the nature of science, and scientific skepticism. We're also joined by Gabriel Dall'Alba. Gabriel holds a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the University of Caxias do Sul in Brazil, and is currently pursuing his master's degree at the University of British Columbia in the Genome Science and Technology program. He is the co-founder of the local Brazilian science communication projects, Na Trilha da Razão, and his interests range from evolutionary biology to science education, philosophy of science, and critical thinking. Thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to start things off, then I'm going to hand it over to Guilherme, who will then hand it off to Gabriel, and then we'll open it up. All right, so we're going to talk about scientific reasoning, the nature of science, and then some lessons, practical lessons, current lessons that have just happened. We're talking about science as a process. Well, what do we mean by that? It's not a single occurrence, but it's an ongoing, what have you done for me lately, kind of in your face process that focuses on objectivity and tries to get at the objective truth about cause and effect relationships in the natural world. That's basically what science tries to do. I'm going to talk a bit about scientific reasoning. These can all be found, this information, in most of my books. But this is the kind of information where when you see what's happening on the news now, and you see people taking over the Capitol building, and you realize that a lot of those people were pushed on by a guy like Donald Trump, who can foment conspiracy theories. Why, right? Why would people believe in such ridiculous theories like QAnon and whatnot? Well, if you understand a cult of personality, where the Trump political agenda plays out more like a cult than it does a political party, people will be willing to follow and believe in what seemingly are preposterous ideas. And I'm going to put the blame at, like, this is an indictment of the American education system, that if these people have been taught better from a younger age how science works, how critical thinking works, there might not be so many followers willing to kill people on misinformation. And so there's an infodemic going on in the world now. And part of our purpose for doing this is to try to stop that, to try to intervene and demonstrate how and what methodologies might be able to help us in curbing those types of attitudes worldwide. So when we talk about science, right, we're talking about various claims involving the natural world, physical empirical evidence that we're on the right track in understanding natural properties and mechanisms. Science, as we know, involves induction or inductive reasoning, which is to say it looks for patterns of behavior that are consistently representative over and over and over again within observable empirical experiences. And we build on those, and we can develop hypotheses, we can test these, we can even develop rigorous theories and even develop laws and understand how properties of the natural world actually work in a cause and effect relationship. And when we look at something in the world and we see this repeated behavior over and over again under those same types of circumstances, what we do in science is we conclude that it's likely to behave the same way in the future. And why don't we say it will behave exactly the same way in the future is because what lies at the basis of scientific reasoning is actually an element of humility. This element of humility, I've argued elsewhere, comes from more than likely the ancient Greeks, especially the skeptics, who would proceed with understanding the natural world, always with the caveat, always with the proviso that if new information or new evidence comes along, we have to follow that evidence. In fact, in science, we have a duty to follow where the evidence leads, irrespective of how much joy we have for hanging on to a particular view or understanding of that aspect of the world. Some people say, like Steven Pinker, you should abandon 5 hypotheses before breakfast. You should never be so attached to something that you wouldn't be willing to give it up if the evidence presented itself in a particular way. And so here's what I think needs to be taught at the earliest stages where students can understand. And I think in education, we've lost our way. And I imagine in the Q&A, we're probably going to talk about, like the new woke movement, where they're trying to devalue not just scientific reasoning, not just what I'll be discussing, the scientific method here. They're actually going after math and logic now as cultural inventions that may just as likely be abandoned and others used in their place. If we allow for that type of reasoning, then we're really giving up on objectivity. Then, we just surrender our values for science and for what science has done and will continue to do. So when we look at something like, and I'm calling this the scientific method, but, is there an exact scientific method? Science is a little bit messy at times, but generally speaking, it's going to come into these basic steps, right? So basically what we do is there's an observation of phenomena. Whatever that phenomenon happens to be, there's an observation made. And then we want to know what caused that thing, right? Like, why did that occur? And so we come up with educated guesses, or we come up with hypotheses. And these aren't wild hypotheses. If we want to understand, why a particular flight was shot down by Iranian military, we can't just say anything, right? We can't just say it was UFOs, right? Because that's, as Carl Sagan said, that's an extraordinary claim. So we have to stay within the realm of possibilities. So these hypotheses are kind of focused within that realm. And what we do once we have an educated guess as to why something occurred, we make predictions. And we say, I bet, if my hypothesis is true, then when we look for data, this is what we're likely to find, right? We make predictions that, we should expect to see these types of empirical observations if I'm on the right track here. And so then experimentation and data collection is conducted, and we sift through that, and we see if the prediction matches the hypothesis. That's really what this comes down to. Because in the 5th step, we've got 3 options, right? There's 3 possible outcomes. Either the data positively supports our prediction. We can say tentatively, okay, we have hypothesis confirmation, at least now. And in science, it's always tentative. It's always tentative because in that level of humility where we could be wrong, where we accept that we might not know everything about the cause and effect relationship of natural phenomena, we have to be prepared to change it, to alter it as new evidence, as new information comes to light. So we'll say, okay, for now we have hypothesis confirmation. Now, if we sift through the data and we do our experimentation and it doesn't match, it doesn't support our prediction, then we have to abandon our hypothesis. And we might even have to give it up, or perhaps, you know, at the most, we'll modify the hypothesis. Sometimes there just isn't enough data to decide either way. And so we suspend judgment. The recent release of the naval footage of UFOs, you know, seems bizarre, seems remarkable. Okay, so what are we looking at? We don't know. We don't know. Who knows? Can you tell me? If you can tell me, please do. Could it be an optical illusion? Yes. Could it be little green men from Alpha Centauri? I don't know, maybe, but we don't know. So we're just going to have to suspend judgment. I don't think there's enough evidence either way, other than what we were witnessing was in fact an unidentified flying object. And we leave it at that. If you want to make further guesses as to what you think that might be, that's fine. Where's your evidence? You know, I'm willing to listen. And I really hope they are, you know, aliens from other planets. How cool would that be? I mean, I would absolutely love that. So would we all love that. But wishing something doesn't make it so. And that's what we have to remember in science. We have to follow where the evidence leads us. Perhaps the most important step in scientific reasoning is, even if it turns out to be that our data positively supports our prediction, and we tentatively have hypothesis confirmation, we can never let our guard down. We have to always consider, are there competing hypotheses out there, right? What seems more reasonable, right? If we're willing to accept the hypothesis confirmation, we must always continue to be on our guard that it may need to be modified, that in fact there might be co-causal elements that we hadn't thought about earlier, so that we revise as we move along. Science is a dynamic, never a static process. It's constantly evolving, constantly searching for more and more evidence to gain a greater, more comprehensive picture and understanding to cause and effect relationships. So here's the bread and the toaster example, right? Scientific reasoning has become our most powerful tool in understanding these cause and effect relationships, and it provides the greatest strength for our premises in support of our explanations. So let's say you're putting bread in a toaster, you push it down, you go off to get your morning coffee or whatever you do, and you come back and it hasn't popped yet to give you the wonderful golden toasty delight that you're anticipating. It's still just bread. And okay, so what's going on? The toaster isn't working. That's step one. You've made an observation. Okay, I made an observation. Toaster isn't working. Hypothesis time. Why? Why isn't the toaster working? There are a number of hypotheses, right? It's not plugged in. So what you do is you go about making predictions, right? I predict that if it's not plugged in, that's the reason why. So then you do the observation, you look, nope, it's plugged in. Boom. So you now have a falsified hypothesis. You thought it just wasn't getting electricity. Clearly it's plugged in. You have to now move. You have to go into this dynamic process of moving to your next hypothesis. Is there electricity coming from that outlet? All right. There are ways in which you can test for that, right? You can plug something else into it and see if, say, a lamp comes on. If the lamp comes on, that means the toaster is getting electricity. Something internally is wrong with the toaster itself. If you're not getting electricity out of the socket, then you might have a breaker has blown, some type of fuse, and you continue to proceed. If you are getting electricity, then you know it's internal, something to do with the toaster itself. Then you have various limited options. It's within the plug or the cord itself. It's within an internal timer or fuse within the toaster. Very limited options less, but nonetheless, that is how we proceed with the scientific method. And eventually we will get to the bottom of why this toaster isn't operating properly. And so it's something as mundane as our morning breakfast teaches us the scientific method. This is what children, from kindergarten to grade 8, this is the most crucial age group that we need to get critical thinking tools and scientific reasoning across to, so that they're better prepared, they're better empowered with reasoning throughout their lives. Because this type of reasoning, it doesn't stay at the office when you go home, so to speak. It follows you wherever you go, always. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you are in this world. If you're able to use scientific reasoning as this process to better understand natural phenomena, you will be able to live in a way that is more conducive to being successful in life. You'll be able to make better predictions. You'll be able to make better decisions, solve problems more easily, and so on. And then be empowered to understand what's happening on the news, to be able to call people like Trump out, right? Like, could you imagine the audacity of him sitting in that room? I don't know if you ever saw it, that press conference, telling those scientists, I don't even think scientists know what this is all about. Like, the audacity of that incredibly stupid individual human being to say that. He is the worst type of threat because he doesn't even know how ignorant he is. And there is nothing more deadly in the human condition than blind ignorance, not even knowing you don't know. And Mr. Trump was the embodiment of that when it came to critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and scientific reasoning. Scientific studies are often the hallmark of how we gain further data to be able to know what is happening within the natural world. So, of course, this was given to Twain, right? 3 types of lies, stem lies, and stats. I mentioned 67.52% of all stats are made up on the spot. This is a joke. If you're going to bullshit somebody, be specific, right? Don't make it up too easily. So here's some important questions for studies, because people will use this as basically evidence for their premises in support of a conclusion. Studies indicate that. Studies show that. There's a new study out that demonstrates. Fine. Studies are great. Science depends on a lot of them. But we have to know who conducted them and why. What was the motivation? Why, why did this individual, this group, this university, this business, whatever, take it upon themselves to conduct this study? Where'd the money come from? And what was the methodology? We have to consider, how large was the sample? How representative was the sample of the general population under study at that particular time? And is the study repeatable? So if any of us then carried out that study, would we, under similar conditions, arrive roughly at the same findings? And you can see why these questions are important here, because one of the examples I recall on, I think it was a show, As It Happens, on CBC Radio one night, was there was a study conducted that showed that hand dryers, the air hand dryers in washrooms, are not as efficient as using paper towels. And the reason why is because their studies indicated that people don't spend enough time under those air hand dryers to completely dry, thereby leaving moisture on their hands. Bacteria needs moisture, right? The type of bacteria you'd find in washrooms, E. coli and other types, need moisture in order to thrive. Then us, with our moist hands, grab that door handle, and then the next person grabs that door handle. So that's how bacteria transfer and makes people sick. So, when I heard this, I thought, fantastic. Epidemiologists are getting together. They're discussing how the transfer of bacteria moves through a population. This is fascinating. This is wonderful. Until the next night, they found out who funded the study. And of course, it was the paper towel industry of Canada that did it. And all they looked at was a couple of washrooms in the Greater Toronto area. I think it was just a men's and a women's. And, how awkward is that? What are they in there watching the people? Are they filming people? Like, it raised all kinds of problems. So once we looked then at the methodology, we realized it was such a small sample that even if it was true, the study itself does not indicate that. Like, in our minds, it might make sense. Okay, that might make sense. Yeah, and it could be true. It's just that the study itself wasn't robust enough to be able to support that claim. And so these are the questions we have to ask ourselves, right? These empower us with the ability to really cut through any references that people want to use as evidence, including ourselves. And it can be for anything, you know, the capital punishment, you know, it reduces crime. Well, does it? Well, studies indicate, do they? Where? Which studies? And are there any counter studies to those? So we always need to be on our guard whenever anyone tries to support a conclusion with the statement, studies show that. So we can remember these 5 questions. We can remember the 6 steps of scientific methodology. And those alone give the average person, who, by the way, probably has no idea about this information, enough empowerment to be able to sit back, and whenever they see something in media, in any form of media, they're a little more empowered to say, hang on here, what are you guys claiming here? And why should I believe that? Okay. So these types of questions, this type of information empowers anybody in a fairly quick way how to be better empowered with understanding the scientific method and what happens when somebody tries to promote ideas that don't necessarily fit with this methodology. So I'm going to hand things over to Guilherme, if you want to take it from here, sir.
All right, Chris, thank you. Let me share my screen. All right, well, good afternoon. I will talk about an infamous story of science and use it to discuss some of the features of the nature of science. Some of them Chris have said before, so I will work on some of the things he said and show other things. Well, in December 18th, in 1912, 2 scientists, one of them was an amateur scientist, Charles Dawson, and Arthur Smith Woodward, who was part of the geology department of the British Museum of Natural History, announced the discovery of skull fragments, a jawbone, and a set of teeth in a gravel pit near Piltdown in England. It was the material was part of a specimen, an individual or organism that had a human-like cranium and an ape-like jaw, which was something different from what was expected in that time, given what we knew about hominids and apes and human ancestors. They gave this specimen a name, or this species a name, Eutropus dawsoni, and some people regarded, or some scientists regarded it as the missing link between ape and human beings, which was one of the most important scientific discoveries of all time, if it was true. Here we have Dawson on our left and Smith Woodward on the right side of the picture, digging for more remains or more fragments of the Piltdown Man. Here we have 2 reconstructions. On the left, we have the reconstruction made by Arthur Smith Woodward, the second person who worked on or who had access to the remains. And one thing that was very interesting is if you look at the reconstruction on the left, it's a mix of human characteristics and ape characteristics, and that was somehow weird in that time. Well, the Piltdown Man, when it was presented to the public and to the scientific community, the scientists were initially divided about what the animal or the species meant. Was it a real missing link? Was it a real ancestor of human beings, or a part of the human tree of evolution? Or a second opinion, or a second option was it was a specimen that was mistakenly assembled from pieces of different animals that were found in the same gravel pit. Sometime perhaps Dawson got bones from a human being and other bones from an ape and from different animals, and he imagined they were part of just one organism. In the beginning, British scientists were much more excited about the discovery than people or scientists or experts from other countries. The initial skepticism diminished because there were some additional discoveries in Piltdown. In 1913, for example, Teilhard de Chardin, who was a priest and a naturalist, found a right canine tooth apparently belonging to the original jaw. And in 1917, there was an announcement of the discovery of new skull fragments in the second site, which was about 4 or 5 kilometers from the original site. Here we have, based on 110 publications between 1913 and 1953 about the Piltdown Man, we have the percentage of acceptance of the species as something real. In blue, is the blue is based on the works of British scientists. The red line is based on the work of scientists from other countries. You can see that British scientists tended to, or on average at least, to accept or to have a more positive view about what the Piltdown Man was. But again, it was never it never reached a kind of consensus in the scientific community. Some people really believed it was something real. Some people had some doubts about the scientific status of the Piltdown Man, until 1953, when finally we understood the story. Weiner, Oakley, and Lee Gross Clark published this paper, The Solution of the Piltdown Problem, in which they presented results of some chemical analysis on the bones, on the fragments of the Piltdown Man. Well, they concluded, well, the chemical tests conducted with the fragments indicated they were no more than 50,000 years old. Dawson and Smith Woodward claimed that the Piltdown Man was about 500,000 years old, so it was much younger than what Dawson and Smith Woodward imagined. We had also some anatomical analysis that indicated the cranium belonged to a human being and the jaw belonged to an orangutan. So there were indeed two species involved, a modern human being and a orangutan. And the fragments and teeth were artificially stained to appear older than they were. So Chris said about induction. So we can conclude, given that, or you can infer to the best explanation that this was a hoax, right? We had chemical tests were indicated that the fragments were not that old. We had very good evidence that the pieces belonged to different animals, at least 2 different animals. And also we have good evidence that the fragments and teeth were artificially modified by someone. We still don't know who, but many people point to Charles Dawson, the guy who discovered the remains, as the author of the hoax, but there is still an ongoing conversation about that. Well, some people ask, or even some scientists ask, why did it take so long to uncover the hoax? We're talking about 40 years. Stephen Jay Gould, the late paleontologist and zoologist, wrote an essay about the Piltdown Man, and he discussed why did the scientific community take 40 years to uncover something that, according to Gould, was something pretty simple. It was not even an elaborate hoax. It was something simple. But I think we can, for us to understand some parts or some aspects of the nature of science, there are 2 better questions or 2 other questions we can ask. The first one is, how have we come to know the Piltdown Man is a hoax? Or, a similar question, how did scientists unveil the hoax? If we open a book on evolution, on human evolution, no one will see the Piltdown Man as a species in the book. And this happens because we know it was a hoax. We know Piltdown Man is not real. And that's a good question. How do we know it? And the response or the answer to those questions gives us some light about how science works, about the nature of science itself. Well, before getting to the point of how do you know the truth about the Piltdown Man, it's interesting to think about what justified the acceptance of the Piltdown Man. It's interesting to note that not every scientist at that time believed the Piltdown Man was real. There was, since 1912, 1913, there was already some controversy about what those remains meant. But there are 3 reasons that justify the acceptance, at least by some experts in anthropology and evolution. The first one is that with Piltdown Man, England could be the cradle of humanity. Many of the, or most scientists who thought of the Piltdown Man as a real animal were from England, and perhaps not consciously. It was a good conclusion, or an emotionally interesting conclusion. If the Piltdown Man if the ancestor of human beings was an English animal or an species that lived in England. The second reason for the acceptance of the Piltdown Man at that time is that the skull, the modern shaped skull, was consistent with the brain-centered perspective of human evolution, a theory that was accepted by some scientists then. According to the theory, we evolved, or the first feature, the first part of our bodies that evolved from apes was our brain. So we developed larger skulls to hold larger brains, and then the rest of the body, it changed after that. This is a theory we don't, it's not an accepted theory anymore, but it was accepted by some experts at that time. And the third reason is that the fragments were hidden from scientists. So most experts, or at least initially, most experts had to evaluate models of the pieces of the Piltdown Man. So as Chris said before, we have to check the evidence, check the data to see if the conclusion of the previous authors is correct. But in this case, the fragments or the real pieces of the Piltdown Man were not accessible to many scientists, at least for some years. But yes, we understand now that it is a hoax. Piltdown Man is not a real animal. And that's a good question to think about the nature of science, right? How did scientists unveil the hoax? Well, first of all, because of the recognition that there is an objective truth about the issue, about the world in general. So we have to research, you have to keep on asking questions, keep on trying to figure out what are the truths involved in the case of the Piltdown Man. The second is fallibilism, or when science embraces fallibilism, as Chris said before, we consider the possibility that scientists that did some work before us were wrong, intentionally in the case of the Piltdown Man, or in most cases unintentionally. So if you recognize that science is performed by human beings who are fallible animals, we need to be open-minded and intellectually humble to review things, check the data, and be open to change our minds, as Chris said, given the evidence points us to a different conclusion. These are aspects, fallibilism, open-mindedness, and intellectual humility that don't operate only at individual level, right? And that's perhaps the most important part, or the most important element of the nature of science. Science is a collective enterprise, is a social endeavor, right? Science is not made only by one person, one scientist, or a group of scientists. It happened in the case of the paper tower that Chris said before. It happened in the case of the Piltdown Man, and pretty much in any other case, on any other aspect or idea in science. So science also depended on other scientists, depended on the work of other scientists to know more about the Piltdown Man. We can call it epistemic dependence. Not only of dependence on other evolutionary biologists, but also on people who worked with chemistry, in the case of the people who did the dating methods to check the bonds of the fragments of the Piltdown Man. Also, we were from 1912 to the 50s. We also learned a lot of human evolution. We have discovered other species, and the Piltdown Man it was difficult to place the Piltdown Man in the human tree, given what we've already known about human evolution. So the dependence of other experts helped us to unveil the hoax and discover the truth about the Piltdown Man. The other feature of science, or nature of science, is organized skepticism. This is a term proposed by sociologist Robert Merton. and as a part of the ethos of science. Robert Bannock, a philosopher who wrote an Instinct for Truth book, a recent book about the nature of science, said that we can think of skepticism working in science at different levels. People can have, scientists can have skepticism of self. When a scientist thinks critically about his or her work, about his or her methods, about his or her conclusions. Obviously, in the case of a hoax, there is no skepticism of self, so we depend on the skepticism of others. So all the other scientists have to check the data, verify the conclusions, verify the steps that were taken by other scientists to see if their conclusions are reasonable. And the work of the scientific community to scrutinize the claims of Dawson and Smith-Woodward and to manage the biases of individual scientists. Human beings are biased for different reasons, and all of us, to some degree, have our biases and they influence the way we think about the world. But a way to diminish the influence the bias is when you work within a community of other people who can check your ideas, can build on them, perhaps can refute them, can refine them, and can help you think better about your own ideas. So the participation of different scientists, for example, scientists from other countries than Britain, helped us to reduce the biases of the experts on the Piltdown Man and to get to the right conclusion about the hoax. So, I mean, in a few words, we can think of the nature of science as a human enterprise that is searching for the truth, but not with capital T, with small t, that is conducted by animals, in this case, human beings that can fail in the way they conduct their researches. That's why we need to be open-minded and humble to check again our assumptions, our data, and our conclusions. Science is also a social endeavor in which we depend on the knowledge of other people to help us understand the world and to help us refine what we think about the world, right? And also on the skepticism of people to check the ideas of other people and reduce the biases of individual scientists. I'll finish my part with two passages. This one is written by a philosopher, Massimo Pigliucci, in a text about the Piltdown Man. He writes that science is a social activity unlike any other that human beings engage in. It's a game of discovery played against a powerful but neutral opponent, nature itself. And nature cannot be fooled, at least not for long. The reason suspicions kept mounting about the true origin of the Piltdown remains was that the more paleontologists uncovered about human evolution, the less Dawn Man seemed to fit with the rest of the puzzle. This is pretty much epistemic dependence, right? In a sense, the very factor that made the acceptance of Eutropus dawsoni so fast in the beginning, because it seemed to be the much sought after missing link in human evolution, was also the reason why 4 decades later, scientists kept pursuing the possibility that it was not genuine after all. We have updated our knowledge from 1912 to 1950 about human evolution, about dating methods, and all of that helped us to uncover the truth about the Piltdown Man. Again, a work of a community or communities of scientists helping each other, evaluating the works of each other, and for us to gain a better understanding of the world. Here is Sloman and Fernbach in an excellent book called The Knowledge Illusion. They write that the truth is that in the real world, nobody operates in a vacuum. Detectives have teams who attend meetings and think and act as a group. Scientists not only have labs with students who contribute critical ideas, but also have colleagues, friends, and nemesis who are doing similar work, thinking similar thoughts, and without whom the scientist would get nowhere. And then there are other scientists who are working on different problems, sometimes in different fields, but nevertheless set the stage through their own findings and ideas. Once we start appreciating that knowledge isn't all in the head, that is shared within a community, our heroes change. Instead of focusing on the individual, we begin to focus on a larger group. This is also true for our daily inquiries, right? We need the help of other people to make sense of the things, but especially true for science, right? We need the works of other people to help us understand the world. And the Piltdown Man is just one example, but we can find the same pattern um, of epistemic and attitudinal elements and values that helped us to discover some truths with multi about the world. And Gabriel will show us how the social nature of science is helping us to understand more and more about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. So Gabriel, I will close my presentation. It's up to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Guilherme. Thank you, Chris. My presentation will actually echo a lot that was already discussed here. Hopefully everyone can see and everyone can hear me well. If someone can please confirm, I appreciate.
Yes, that's
yes.
okay.
Perfect, then. Yes, okay. So really, as I just said, it's going to echo a lot what's been discussed so far. And I structured in the form of lessons, and I quote these lessons. This is open for discussion. I will show 3 stories that happened around 2020. And these 3 stories are, well, obviously all centered around COVID and centered around this interesting phenomena that we can observe, that the scientific endeavor got surprisingly fast, as it was a general demand from scientists to the general public that we want fast solutions to the pandemic. It's natural. No one can be blamed for that. And so the nature of science in this context actually can be seen surprisingly faster than 40 years for the case of Piltdown Man. So I'm going through the case of hydroxychloroquine, this anti-malarial drug that got the spotlight for more than half a year and got some remarks from Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil as the miracle drug. Over 55 countries actually used as a preemptive measure, some form of medication to try to prevent COVID, and it's a real mess. Bolsonaro made some weird and very weird decisions about buying tons of hydroxychloroquine, and they are all stored right now with no use whatsoever. And the other 2 are 2 Nobel laureates, actually. Mario Molina, who unfortunately passed away in 2020, and Luc Montagnier. And I'm going to go through their stories, what happened in 2020 around these 3 elements, and maybe we can get the conversation going about the nature of science and about looking at science as a process. So the first case is actually from Luc Montagnier, and he is a virologist. He actually won the Nobel Prize for discovery of HIV, or identification of HIV. And so you can hold Luc Montagnier as an expert, especially in virology. And this is a field that naturally was demanded in 2020, still is demanded. But he came out on a French TV channel declaring that his conclusions, the conclusions of his research group, showed that the genome of SARS-CoV-2, all the DNA found in the novel coronavirus, had pieces that didn't really seem to fit the puzzle, as we just using the same terminology we were using so far, in particular, of course, of HIV. And he came to the conclusion that not only that is not natural, but is the work of professionals, of molecular biologists, and it's a very meticulous work. So here we have a claim that is extraordinary, and here we have to echo Sagan and the extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, which Montagnier and his group unfortunately didn't really provide. The claim was rebutted actually in a paper published in Nature shortly after, that's about the proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2. And indeed, it has natural origins. The origins comes from different animals. It is not man-made, or at least we don't have enough evidence to support that this is the case of a man-made virus. And Luc Montagnier is actually an interesting case for other reasons. as well. One of them is actually mentioned in this Skeptical Inquirer paper, The Noble Disease, where they kind of go through some Nobel laureates that fails to protect themselves against irrationality. And this is an example of irrational claim in all sorts of evidence, in the face of evidence we had and we have so far. Also, I have to point out for clarification that the 3 stories I'm taking here, they could, every single one of them, easily be a whole webinar. So this is a summary. This should be, I hope, and I'm doing the honest work of trying to get some messages out of these summaries. But all these stories are very fascinating. The second one is actually the story of Mario Molina. Mario Molina is a chemist, and he's a Nobel laureate through his work with CFC gases and the threat to the ozone layer. Back in 1995, he was awarded. And he got through, he and his group got to investigate SARS-CoV-2, as many groups around the world actually shifted their goals to actually try to tackle coronavirus. And he published the paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy, and it had 2 major conclusions, or 2 major claims. One of them is that the analysis they did resulted in showing that the airborne transmission route was of this highly virulent COVID-19 was the dominant way of spread of COVID-19. And not only that, but the mandatory use of masks was the sole effective non-pharmaceutical intervention, leading to the reduction of growth in new cases in places like New York and Italy at the time that those cases were exponentially growing. And then he did some analysis with his group and came to the conclusion that not even social distancing was that important, but the mandatory use of masks was. Shortly after, not even a month later, a group of scientists got together and they wrote an open letter trying to shed some light to the methodological flaws that Mario Molina's work had. And they came to the conclusion that there was just too much problem to be supporting the claims they did. And they also suggested that the proceedings of the National Academy Journal should consider retraction. So here we have 2 different scenarios where we face experts, or to some extent epistemic authorities. But I guess the word that's more proper here is they are experts. At least they have a demonstrated story of scientific rigor, and in a very high one. They were awarded Nobel Prizes, after all, for their work. Luc Montagnier is specifically for the fields that we should be looking when we think about COVID. And Mario Molina is a chemist, but nothing stops him from going in an adventure trying to tackle COVID-19. So, and there's also another interesting point here. While Luc Montagnier's claim was, well, frankly absurd to some extent, Mario Molina's wasn't. And shortly after Mario Molina's paper was received this attention of the problems, actually some evidence came out showing that, yes, we have evidence to support that airborne transmission is one of the most dominant routes for the spread of COVID-19, together with droplets. And so he was not wrong, or at least he was partially wrong about its conclusions, but the evidence he provided to support that wasn't strong enough. And for that reason, his work was scrutinized to a certain extent. And then we have the, quote, final nail in the coffin for hydroxychloroquine. And hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine were these anti-malarial drugs that they were in the spotlight. And at least since February 2020, they had a climbing number of evidence supporting hydroxychloroquine. And then slowly but surely different studies came out revealing some methodological flaws in most of them. And the consensus started to build around hydroxychloroquine not being effective against COVID-19. And at this moment, around May 2020, a paper is published in The Lancet, and it's a huge deal. It actually halted clinical trials around the world because not only they claimed COVID-19 wasn't really solved by hydroxychloroquine, but there was an apparent increased risk of death in patients taking hydroxychloroquine, even with or without antibiotics. And this was huge. There was over 100,000 patients, 700 different hospitals around the world. And most people overlooked the fact that this was an observational study. It was not a clinical trial. It was not what we have as high standard for observations in the drugs or medical fields. So this also led to a group of scientists grouping together, teaming up, sending a letter to the authors asking, well, where's the data? There was a big problem here. They didn't share the data from 96,000 patients, which led the Lancet to emit an expression of concern. And 2 weeks later, the paper was retracted as the authors failed to provide or disclose all the data. Indeed, there was a third-party company involved, and they said they didn't really want to give open access to the data they used. So this paper was an example of an unfortunate bad adventure in trying to shed some light to a very important question that was whether hydroxychloroquine is an efficient treatment. However, and what actually led me and my colleagues to this idea was that this was widely covered on the media, and especially because it was a huge deal. It stopped different clinical trials around the world on the suspect of causing deaths, and that's actually what we are trying to avoid, of course. And you see, and you can look in all the different ways that people expresses their opinions about it, that many people unfortunately missed the point. So they saw this not only as a hit for science's reputation and an allusion to the fact that scientists have no clue of what they are doing, but that this was evidence that hydroxychloroquine worked. Is the case of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was ecstatic when this news of the retraction came about, and his followers as well, people that support Bolsonaro's views in Brazil, and very likely in the United States as well. But in the middle, in the midst all these opinions that goes against the idea that we were looking at the process of science, there were some that actually bring some hope, I guess, to the conversation. People that saw that's the beauty of science, how it constantly self-corrects. And this echoes back to what Guilherme was telling us a few moments ago. And there is value in watching this unravel in our faces. So this question, after all, scientists have no clue about what they are doing, is, well, is even that the right question to be asked? Maybe we should frame it as Guilherme showed the questions made around the Piltdown Man. How scientists during these turbulent times of COVID are actually, and quite rapidly, solving these problems of papers that have been rushed through publication and have methodological flaws. This is an example that we should be looking at. And so the first lesson, it echoes really to what my colleagues were just talking a few moments ago, and that is science is a social activity. And hydroxychloroquine, for instance, is a story that reveals how the organized skepticism is a fundamental aspect underlying the social nature of science. And as Guilherme just said, that the idea from Robert Merton of organized skepticism, it's a very interesting one because it actually places science where in this field where it's most scrutinized. The bar is up for the conclusions and claims that comes through the scientific methods. And it also reveals how important it is for us to take a step back and think of those claims as in probabilistic ways instead of thinking in absolutes. Whether hydroxychloroquine does or does not work, what's the consensus revolving around? What are the scientists up to this moment, with all the evidence we have up to this moment, telling us? And so it gives us, and this probabilistic way of thinking actually comes, at least I recall, learning from Stephen Law, the philosopher, the idea that we can frame this in a way that you can change your opinion, you can change how strongly you believe in one end or the other of the problem you are investigating. And that gives you the same essence of fallibilism. You know that at any given point, you might be surprised by new evidence, and you have to be able to adapt, just as Chris told us. And another important lesson, and at least for the three stories I bring today, we see how the scientific community worked to reject some hypotheses, to reject some claims. And this is important. This is a fundamental aspect, but it's not the only way, of course. The scientific community is the one actually also bringing those claims forward and scrutinizing them appropriately. But this reveals how important and reveals the essence of fallibilism. And then, especially for the case of Mario Molina and Luc Montagnier, that we see how the scientific community or science itself doesn't really hold the expert to a high value. They are important. They are the ones bringing out or being associated with ideas, but it's only one step to recognize the experts and to search for their opinion. Luc Montagnier would be a great example of one expert that you should be, or it's likely to be giving you valuable information in COVID times. He's a virologist, not only a virologist, but a Nobel laureate virologist. So there are a few more things we can discuss. And it revolves around the idea of consensus, the idea of how, generally speaking, the scientific community is talking about some topics. Think about the theory of evolution from Darwin. What is the consensus, or global warming, for instance, where John Cook showed us through some real and good statistics a few years ago, how 96 to 98% of the scientists working with global warming, investigating, researching global warming, actually agree that, not only it happens, but it has some blame to be placed in human beings. So we have to look at this. And COVID actually scrambles this again a little bit. Not only makes everything go fast, but also, if you go back to February 2020, well, are those consensus about COVID back in February strong? Well, actually, we could actually argue that there was lacking evidence to support many of the assumptions being done until we saw COVID unravel and scientists' investigation unravel. It happened to a famous Brazilian doctor that he came out trying to ease the population, to bring some soothing words that no, there wasn't really much to be concerned about back in January. And a few months later, of course, he came back and he showed this epistemic humility. He showed that he understood the essence of fallibilism and said, well, remember what I told in January, what I said? Well, maybe that's not really what's going on. So here's my updated, according to the evidence, view of COVID. And he's an expert, and you can take the word of those experts, but obviously you should not blindly follow them. And one other question is, if the experts are, or the expert you are looking at this moment, is following the consensus? Is he going against? Does he provide enough evidence to not agree with the consensus? And with all that in mind, how strongly should you follow his opinions or her opinions? And then there's this valuable aspect of being able to calibrate how you weight those claims. And this is only achieved, or actually not only achieved, but it is achieved through critical thinking, the ability to properly analyze and scrutinize them, to ask the right questions. Where's the data? Is the data reliable? And so on and so on. And another important reason, and this loops back to the core of this discussion, is that another way of reducing the strength you place under a claim is to see the work of Mario Molina and Luc Montagnier, for instance, or the claims of Luc Montagnier, as a piece of the process, of this ongoing, unstoppable process as far as we know. And they are not the final word. Neither was the paper published in The Lancet. They are pieces of the process. They build towards a consensus. They build towards a more likely explanation to what was going on. But they are not necessarily giving you the final verdict about whether this is true or not, or this is real or this is fake. So it all boils down to our way of receiving information and properly scrutinizing it. And lastly, there are two lessons I give and a third one that we can discuss together. And I hope that I can see some opinions from the public, from everyone watching. That is, well, if we have an agreement that critical thinking skills play a role in navigating through these turbulent times where information not only is coming at your face, but it's coming fast. It's not stopping. And in 2 weeks, you have the supposed final claim for a given topic to go 180 degrees off. And another one that is also interesting is that if we actually understand science as a process, and by this I'm meaning going beyond simply looking at its results, if that would be helpful to navigate through information in these times. And we can think, I can start by giving an interesting example. If you expect if you understand science as a process and you look at the Lancet paper and what happened, would you be really surprised that corrections were made and retractions were made, since, or was you actually expecting, since that's what happens when you are thinking about science? You know, information goes out, it is properly availed, it's properly scrutinized, and well, then you calibrate whether that was good, that was useful, or that, you know, should be differently phrased. For instance, Mario Molina is an interesting scenario because he actually agrees that there was problems in his work. He always maintained the views that his conclusions were reasonable, and well, that was really not in question, but whether the evidence he provided was good enough. And he said that maybe, just maybe, he should have been a little bit more careful with how he qualified those claims, maybe using some guard terms, as Guilherme and I usually talk about, something like it is likely, or, you know, there's a possibility that this is the case, not necessarily that, you know, masks are the sole and only reason that something happened. So this is how science unravels in our faces, in front of our eyes. And I lastly quote Sagan one last time, that science is more than a body of knowledge, it is a way of thinking. And if we frame the way we receive information based on this kind of approach, of looking at pieces of this bigger puzzle instead of always the final word, and the three cases, but more importantly, Mario Molina's and the hydroxychloroquine Lancet paper, they are essentially showing how people look at the results of the scientific endeavor, the products, the papers published, the studies that indicate something, as Chris said. And maybe if we take a step back and think it more broadly about what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on through the process of giving you that paper, maybe you will not be so surprised, and maybe you'll have a more critical way of understanding what's going on. And this was necessary. And this is necessary for COVID-19 times. So this is the end of our part of presentations. I also want to thank the place where this idea actually came to its existence, that is here at UBC Ecoscope, through Dr. Stephen Hallam, who gave us this opportunity to do a knowledge mobilization project. And eventually we came in contact with Humanist Canada, who hosted us. So my dear appreciation to Humanist Canada, to Ecoscope, to UBC, to my dear colleagues, Guilherme and Chris. And we are open for questions and discussions.
Thank you, everybody. This was great. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is from Barry. Shall we also include descriptive science, observing, recording, describing, and classifying phenomena such as occur in biology, astronomy, psychology? Hypothesis, experimentation-driven science is not the only type of respectable science. How do we determine the reliability of descriptive science? Which I guess speaks to the perennial question about the difference between the social sciences and natural sciences as well, right? So.
Someone wants to take the lead to answer?
I can comment on the question, Chris, very briefly. I think it also is related to some aspects of biology or some areas of biological sciences that don't demand or don't necessarily demand experimentation, for example. Taxonomy is one of them. Some areas in paleontology, for example, have different methods of inquiry, right? Sometimes you don't need exactly experimentation or but again, I would just emphasize any area of science depends on the social community or communities of inquiry. So I think that's perhaps one of the things that can unite different areas in science is that it's difficult to find out. There isn't an area in science that is led by the work of individuals isolated. We have to propose ideas, to put forward ideas, conclusions, and then other people will try to figure out if our answers are good enough. Even if we test hypotheses, perhaps we just classify animals and so on. So I think this is something that unites science, its social nature.
Yeah, I agree with Guilherme. The question says, should we also include descriptive science? I think I know what the distinction is there. To be clear, all science is descriptive. So all science is about facts of the natural world. Prescriptive is where ethics and religion and things like that come into effect. So, I mean, it's just splitting hairs, but yeah, all science is inherently descriptive. But I think what this person means is those that don't necessarily have to go through all the 6 steps, simply citing down what observations were made at a given time. Yeah, of course, we have to acknowledge that and pay our respect for those descriptive sciences and facts so assembled. But it's then, what do we do with those facts, and how do they interrelate? And remember, as William Whewell, the great philosopher of science in the 19th century, and then Edward O. Wilson said, there's a consilience in science, so that you can go from different sciences to corroborate ideas. So that's why the beauty of evolutionary theory isn't simply just the biology that Darwin worked through, but it was the genetics and the new synthesis of the two that came together that made it so much more of a robust theory about biology and the way in which species evolved. So,
and I guess that descriptive work that's made, it actually follows the same pattern of how it's being tested throughout time. If that observations are actually up to date 100 years later, that's the case of evolutionary ideas. The ones originally although modified, of course, to accommodate the new evidence from Darwin. So they also have this aspect that they continuously get survival or not through the test of time, you know. That's an interesting aspect as well.
Right.
Okay, the next question is, how would you respond to conspiracy theorists who post videos of doctors across the UK and the US claiming COVID-19 is either a hoax or is blown out of proportion?
Go ahead, Guilherme. I'll let you start with this one.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, because some people, I am a science educator, and some people usually think, some educators think that what people need is information. Information is obviously necessary. We have to provide reliable information to people. But in many cases, information is not enough, right? People are stuck in chambers, in ideological, in social chambers, and they cannot think outside of what their peers think. There's also social pressure to come to certain conclusions. And we see something very similar in Brazil. I was talking to Gabriel and Chris. We met this week preparing the webinar today. And a friend of mine posted on Facebook a video of a doctor, a medical doctor, saying that there's treatment for COVID-19, which is a lie. We don't have the treatment. It's pretty much hospitalization, and now we have vaccines to prevent the disease. But there aren't drugs to take, so we don't know it so far, drugs that are reliable. But the guy shared the video, and a doctor is saying that. It's difficult. I think one of the things we should emphasize, I mean, as science educators and in general terms, is try to help people recognize true expertise and try to recognize the scientific consensus on something, right? Again, this will not help everyone who is a science denier, for example, but we can reach some people. But I think Chris has much more to say about that. He's writing a book on conspiracy, so he's our expert here in this topic.
Thanks, Guilherme. The idea of people who are conspiratorial, what our research team is finding is that it's incredibly difficult to stop conspiratorial information once it's started. It's kind of like unringing a bell. And especially we've seen this with like QAnon, and we've seen it with you know, those who thought that 5G towers were in some way responsible for COVID. And what happens is it's really the concept of how a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And so some people want to be critical thinkers, and so what they're doing is they're trying to connect dots in ways that the average person doesn't see. And so the rest of us then are blinded. You see, we're the fools for not making the connections that they've connected. So there's a level of epistemic status involved with conspiratorial thinking where people say, you know, I know, like, you sheeple don't get it. You know, you fools. Look at the people who rioted the Capitol. Think about this just for a sec. If we truly believed that an election was stolen by Satanists who peddle children out of a pizzeria and drink the blood of fetuses to attain eternal youth, as bizarre as that seems, right? As bizarre as that sounds, if we did believe that, would we not be moved to action if the defender in chief, the defeater of the Antichrist, Donald Trump in this case, told us to go out and take it back? Yeah, what more noble cause could there be than defending the lives of children, these poor innocent children, from these horrible Democrats in their satanic cabal? It makes perfect consistent sense for somebody. So how do we unring the bell? That's the most difficult question in all of critical thinking. Without question, how do you talk to somebody who is dogmatic? How do you get through to them? And in our research, we're finding that it takes a while. It's not a quick fix, unfortunately. There's no pill. You can't give them the red or the blue pill. There's no way to make them just snap out of it. And of course, there are varying degrees of conspiracists. You know, all of us could be conspiracy theorists to some minor degree. If any of us thought that maybe, Oswald didn't work alone in the assassination of JFK, then maybe we're way down on the spectrum of being conspiratorial. And then there are those all the way up to, say, QAnon. So, you know, when we try to, unring that bell, when it comes to medical authorities, and there's this quack out in BC, I won't even mention his name because it doesn't deserve to be mentioned. You can look him up if you want. He's been trying to spread, and he's an MD, he's a big homeopathic guy as well. And he's trying to play down the pandemic as though it's nothing more than your basic flu, and it's way overblown. And all we have to do to defeat it is take vitamin C and zinc. Really, that's all we got to do, just build our immune systems, and everybody's fine, regardless of age. So I came out online, which I rarely do, and said, this guy's a quack. And when you say things like, what should we do with such people? Revoke their license. You're done. If you really believe that and you promote it and you harm a single person in doing that, you should be done, or at least have your license held in suspension until you can demonstrate, why are you believing something, we know has been falsified, that we know is not true. And so I think, we have to be more rigorous, more vigilant, and be able to deal with the so-called experts who do go against, the grain. And in so doing, the conspiracists will grab onto and say, aha, you see here, we've got somebody on our side who supports us, because you can't lend any credence or any further credence to conspiratorial thinking, or it just becomes more and more ingrained in the mind of the conspiracists. So that's what I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Next question. To what extent is the search for profit a problem for science?
Gabriel, you're involved in that right now, sir. You are a student, and you must see how grants are done. How let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, perfect. That's a good question, and I guess it talks a lot with how the academic world is being moved recently. And there is, we have to be honest, there's no real reason to suspect otherwise, that COVID came and basically made people say, okay, this is time for grants. This is time to publish. And well, this is one of the reasons, the foundation reasons for why we saw thousands of papers going on about COVID in a month throughout 2020. So there is this is a problem. This is the way that, we should rethink, in my opinion, how we approach the grants and all the way academic research is conducted. And because by the end of the day, it shouldn't be a problem you want to have profit. You can actually want profit in different ways. You want the general public to profit about, and economically as well. That is actually something that Ecoscope, the one organization here at UBC, actually tries to do, is bring those biotechnology entrepreneur ideas to the general public in a way that everyone can be involved in a positive way. So yes, I think that we have to rethink, and we saw how maybe dangerous it is to just want to speed up for the sake of publishing more and then having more evidence to governments to pay you. That's a problem, and that's one of the reasons why we have this conversation going on right now, because then you have media, you have news outlets trying to give the information to the public, but so many things were so rushed in a way that they lacked the proper time you should give for peer review. And you had media outlets publishing, and actually I found a few examples I just didn't have time to bring here today. For hydroxychloroquine, for instance, papers that were stored in medRxiv or bioRxiv, for instance, they are not peer-reviewed databases, but they are out there, and people can preliminarily place their studies there, policy documents citing those papers, and you have no real scrutiny going on for them. That's the word of the authors, as it is. You know, the first word they have to say about that. No one said, okay, let's think through what you did. Maybe you missed something, and I'm going to tell you. That didn't happen in most cases where you have policy documents going on with citations of those
And
papers.
another issue, Gabriel, and you will maybe be experiencing this. We discussed this, gentlemen, at other times, and that is money tends to go where there's a likelihood of hypothesis confirmation, right? Everybody wants to see their money spent to good use. Hey, they discovered a gene that does X. Wonderful, throw some money at them. Oh, they discovered that gene didn't do X. Oh, boo, too bad. We have to get back to the original way in which science began to proceed in the 40s and the 50s and 60s, which is even falsifying a hypothesis is valuable to the body of knowledge. We now know what isn't the case regarding some aspect of the natural world. And that's really important. And in fact, there are databases set up, and Gabriel and Guilherme, you'll be intimately familiar with this. If you set out to do a thesis or a dissertation on a specific topic and you have this interesting hypothesis, you can actually go and check to see if anybody had that same idea and went down that road and failed. Because again, this saves an enormous amount of time and money and energy. So
yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. And I guess this also reflects on how your positive outcomes of research are the ones that go out to the media, are the ones that your agencies that are paying you are going to spotlight on their websites and
they get published, and you get referred to, and your career goes up. And
yeah,
you know, we've gotten in this weird kind of headspace with money where we're no
exactly.
longer after the pursuit of knowledge for the purity of it, but
Yeah,
money does. So that was a great question. Whomever asked that, that's a
great
very
question indeed. So yeah, so Leslie, I guess you should value those scientists that publishes positive outcomes every time, or should you value the work of scientists that are showing through the scientific process that you can fail as well? That's a good question.
Okay, all three speakers emphasize the need to deal with ambiguity in scientific results. I agree. But public policy needs a degree of certainty. How sure do we need to be before, for example, we mandate masks indoors or enforce curfews and emergency orders or prescribe vaccines, if I may add to that as well?
Another great question, actually.
Go ahead, Guilherme.
Okay, that's a very difficult question, as the other questions that you were asking. And in some cases, it's a matter of cost benefit, right? We don't have, when Gabriel told us about or mentioned scientific consensus, it doesn't exist in all areas of science. For example, if you talk about global warming, it's very reasonable to prepare or to make policies having in mind the conclusion that global warming is occurring and we human beings have an important role in that. So we are the main cause of global warming. But in other cases, it's more difficult, right? You mentioned, for example, masks. In the beginning of the pandemic, there were different positions. The CDC, if I'm not mistaken, didn't recommend masks, or the World Health Organization, I'm not sure. One organization recommended the use of masks and the other didn't. It's difficult to what extent or to which degree of consensus we can have.
And Guilherme,
Okay.
remember Marco Rubio came out against Fauci for switching sides. Senator Marco, this guy,
yeah,
Marco Rubio, remember that guy? This guy?
Yeah.
He came out against Fauci for switching. First you said, no, don't worry about masks. And now Fauci is all about the masks. And he tried to use that as a talking point against science, right?
Yes. And that's, again, it's a misunderstanding of the nature of scientific process, right? New evidence appears and our minds have to change accordingly, right? So, and even for people who make policies, sometimes it's difficult, right? We try to sometimes act in the dark because we don't have enough evidence and you have to figure something out. it's difficult, but I think in terms of masks, perhaps we have also relied on previous work on other viruses, for example, and I think the first decision of, I don't know if CDC, not to ask people to wear masks because they were fearing some surgical or some masks could be, people would buy a lot of masks and then people in hospitals would be without masks. So perhaps it's a kind of the decision was in terms of logistics or something like that. But again, it's difficult. It's really difficult to understand or to draw a line. For, look, we have to reach this amount of consensus in order to do something. It's very difficult, right?
If I may add one thing, I guess is important as well for politicians and for those people that are representing the general public in many different ways, to be properly advised when they are unsure about scientific topics. You know, that may be something that leads to this confusion, and someone should be there and giving them, you know, solid advice of what is going on. You know, it's a gamble, as Guilherme just said, back in March and February, that would be a real, it would be really difficult to give you a proper answer as, okay, you should wear mask, you shouldn't wear mask, what's going on, you know, all brand new. Now we should have more evidence to work. We definitely have more evidence to work towards, but maybe filtering the scientific information, this will actually echo to some other questions, I presume, being able to filter what is good and what should be accounted for when making policies and when guiding the general public. It's also very, very important.
Let me just add something. It's also important for governments to be able to revise their policies. It's also, they need to be open-minded enough to receive new evidence, to figure out how relevant the new evidence is, and then change some kind of policy if there are good reasons to do it. Right?
Yeah, lead by example. You know how
Yes,
to think about science.
Thank you. So maybe we can take one last question. Congratulations for the excellent seminar. I agree with you about the importance of the critical thinking piece, but one of the most difficult topics is how do you make people understand what it is? Because science is so far removed from the non-scientific community. So how do you bridge the gap?
Okay, first you start by writing books like these for people our age. But Gabriel and Guilherme and I have had this exact discussion about this question, and what a great question to end on. An organization I'm working with now is a think tank, and the CEO and I have been talking about what's the best way to get critical thinking across to people. And we've decided to start young. We can't try to unring the bell with people who have already solidified their own thinking patterns. So the next book I'm going to be writing will be critical thinking from toddlers to tweens. So really, if we can get the younger people thinking critically at an earlier age, thinking scientifically at an earlier age, the harder it's going to be for conspiratorial beliefs to get through that discipline in order to convince them. Look at other countries around the world, look at the rate of how they teach critical thinking, and look at the level of conspiratorial thinking, right? There's direct inverse proportions between the amount of critical thinking taught and the amount of belief in conspiratorial thinking. Our research shows this clearly. So now we're going to focus on the younger generation and teach them all the way through, and hopefully that will go some distance in trying to curb the amount of bad thinking that exists out there.
Yeah, Chris, I would just like to add that we also have, and thank you, Eduardo, who's a friend of us, for the question. And I also add that we need, as educators, also to emphasize not only the methods of science or scientific ideas and the process of science, but also some values that are related to science: open-mindedness, skepticism of self, right? Fallibilism, intellectual humility. and also emphasize to the students that being wrong is not an embarrassment, right? Not in science and in our ordinary lives, right? We have to be wrong to correct ourselves. We have to be open to learn, and so
That's a
being
good
wrong is not.
point. Guilherme, that's such a good point. In the book on conspiracy theory that I'm writing now, I'm really emphasizing, folks, do you know who Kyrie Irving is? So he's a
Yes.
great basketball player, like one
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
best right now. But he was a flat earther, right? And he started to let people know he was a flat earther. And, you know, teachers were coming up to him and saying, you're making it really difficult for me to do my job. He is now a reformed flat earther. He now realizes he went down some YouTube rabbit holes. I think it's our job as educators then to applaud these guys as much as possible in appreciating their capacity to change their minds. Okay, so we don't ridicule conspiracy theorists. We congratulate them when they realize, okay, I see where I went wrong. So that's you're bang on, Guilherme, with the whole value system is so important. And as that process, we need to be able to let people know. Of course, none of us are perfect. You know, who knows what I believed when I was younger that I now no longer believe, right? So an excellent point. Sorry, keep going.
Oh yes, and I think, Chris, that's the point, right? It's not, some people think it's a virtue to hold an idea and to keep it forever, right? A virtue is to think critically about what we think, about how we behave, about the things we believe. And I think this is a virtue, right? Being open enough to reflect or to have a good amount of metacognition, right? To reflect or to think about our own thinking. And this is something also that I suppose educators should foster in their classrooms, in from like kindergarten to the university. I think it's something all of us would benefit from that.
We do have a few questions that unfortunately we won't be able to address. So I would like to invite the speakers if you have any final comments.
I just want to say, Gabriel put our email contacts up. If anybody wants to carry on the conversation further, they're certainly welcome to reach out to us.
Yeah, I would like once again to not only thank the presence of everyone that watched us. Hopefully this conversation will keep going. The idea is not to provide final answers, as we just gone through that, but to keep the conversation going outside this webinar to our daily lives. We should be talking about, and we should be keep going on critical thinking and how science can be approached. And also, thank you, Humanist Canada, for hosting us once again. Thank you, my dear friends and colleagues, Chris and Guilherme. It was a brilliant and I guess a very enjoyable 1.5 hour of talking.
Thank you very much, Guilherme, Chris, and
Yes.
Gabriel.
Sorry, Anna, I'm just sharing the screen. If you have any questions, here we have our emails and we can keep the conversation going, as Chris said. On my part, I thank you, Anna, and the friends from Humanist Canada, Gabriel, Chris, and all of us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we can see the information being displayed. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
You can see?
Yep.
Right.
Thank you very much to the panelists for the excellent presentation. And just a couple of words as we wrap up our session. As always, I would like to invite everybody to fill out the post-webinar survey that you will receive in the follow-up email. We always appreciate your feedback. Also, our organization is supported by membership and donations. So if you can and would like to contribute to our educational programs, including the webinars, you can do so on our website, humanistcanada.ca. If you're not a member of Humanist Canada and would like to continue your journey with us, you can take out a membership on our website as well by clicking on the join button. And finally, our next webinar will take place on February 21st, and our topic will be One School System in Ontario. And you can find more information about the speakers and the description in our newsletter, as well as on our website and social media platforms. Once again, thank you very much, Chris, Guilherme, and Gabriel. And thank you all for attending. Stay safe and connected, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.